voter bias, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. It's interesting. One of the stories that I'm going to be covering tonight actually contains a trigger warning as the story is published. Now, beware, this could be upsetting to some people, and I feel like it's probably in the interest of everyone that I warn you that I'm going to be using some truth and logic and speaking directly, which could be triggering to some people, and you'll be surprised when you find out who exactly that's going to be triggering. I don't intend to push any kind of enemy-driven thinking, but I'm certainly going to show you an example of enemy-driven thinking coming from sources that you may not have anticipated. But first, let's start with what I think is going to be a very familiar topic to us over the next little bit, and that is funding for schools. Look at this headline of the Idaho State Journal from a couple of days ago. Reclaim Idaho delivers petitions to Secretary of State to get school funding initiative on November ballot. Now, I saw some video from this, and actually it looked like it was really a fun event. Looked like everybody was having a good time, and of course, lots of bright, colorful signs. Every Idaho child deserves a quality education. You know, I don't know anybody who would disagree with that. Now, where we may disagree is how exactly that's going to happen. So let's dive into the story a little bit further and see what exactly is in store for us. The Idaho State Journal tells us that to the cheering of these volunteers in bright T-shirts, they gathered on the Capitol steps for a rally before delivering the petitions, at which Luke Mayville, Reclaim Idaho co-founder, brandished a copy of the Idaho Constitution. He told the crowd, when the founders of our state drafted this document 132 years ago, they stated clearly that it is the obligation of our legislature to provide a quality education to every Idaho child. But in recent decades, he said, especially in the last 20 years, the majority of our legislators failed to fulfill their obligation to Idaho's children. They let Idaho sink to 50th out of 50 states in funding for education. Well, that does sound pretty serious. 50th out of 50 states? Holy cow, how can we even hold our heads up when we walk down the street? I'm surprised people aren't shaming us everywhere we go. Except that really doesn't give us enough context to understand. So if it's a funding problem, does this mean that Idaho students are somehow languishing? That somehow they're not graduating at the proper rate, or that they're graduating as functional illiterates? I mean, because that would be some pretty potent reasoning to up the funding, wouldn't it? But that's not the case. And this is something that unless you're willing to dig into the issue, people often don't understand. That the per pupil funding makes for some great talking points, but it doesn't ever really translate into, well, how well is this school district doing? For instance, I can recall a few years ago, Washington, D.C., I believe, had one of the most highly funded school districts in the country, well above what other districts were spending on their per pupil rate. Now, keep in mind, this was 8, maybe 10 years ago. Their graduation rate couldn't even break 72%. That was the worst. That was worse than any of the states in the nation. This is the District of Columbia. So all that funding, what exactly was it doing? The answer is it was supporting a very large bureaucracy, but not really translating into the students getting the tools that they needed or the education that they needed. So I think most of us would agree a quality education is definitely something that Idaho students do deserve. Now the question is the only way to do that through the state and through putting greater burdens on the taxpayers? Let's take another look at this story here. 50th out of 50 states, but listen to this clarification by Mr. Mayville. He says, we know this initiative won't solve every problem in our education system. And I believe he's talking about the government education system. But make no mistake, this initiative will be the most significant investment in our schools in a generation. You're going to hear that word a lot as this ballot initiative likely makes it to the November ballot. Now, investment is a much easier way of saying tax hike. Tax hike, as the focus groups probably showed, doesn't have that positive of a connotation. Investment, though, well, of course, we're just investing in our future. And this is where much of the Idaho media is lining up. We're going to talk about this as a very positive thing. It's an investment in the future. It's an investment for students. But what does it mean for the taxpayers? because this is really where the rubber is going to meet the road. Now, the initiative, dubbed the Quality Education Act, would increase corporate and personal income taxes on the wealthiest taxpayers. I know, you and I are both breathing a sigh of relief. Well, that's certainly not going to be me. Well, until the wealthiest taxpayers are redefined to a slightly lower level. But no, we'll keep thinking that. To raise hundreds of millions in additional funding for Idaho schools, with the aim of pulling Idaho out of last place in the country for per pupil school spending. Now, again, just because we spend less does not mean that our students are somehow doing worse than every other student in the country. So I would like to see, what are some of the qualifications for why that's such a terrible place to be, if in fact we're getting more bang for our buck than places that are spending more. Now, that's the opposite direction this article says Idaho lawmakers have been moving in recent years. They've passed record corporate and personal income tax cuts in each of the past 2 legislative sessions, reducing state tax revenues by hundreds of millions of dollars. I guess that's tragic if you are a bureaucrat who depends on those tax revenues. But let me again translate this into what that really means. That means that they have cut the amount of money taken from the productive people who actually earned that money. Remember, the state can't create wealth. It doesn't produce wealth of its own. It can only take from those who have actually created something of value and in turn, been compensated for it. So I know it's but it's for the children. Yes, I think we can all agree that's a good thing. But if we want more money for education, and this seems to have been a mantra pretty much everywhere that I have ever lived, there's always been the idea, education needs more money. Okay, I can agree with that on some level. Although sometimes I think what education needs is more freedom. Because with more freedom, you can actually get by with less money. Case in point, there are private schools that can get by and do more for less money on per pupil spending. And they're in a competitive market. They have to do a better job than other private schools in order to attract, their clientele. Government schools, well, we'll just go to the taxpayers. We'll just make sure that they do more. That's what this initiative is trying to do. The initiative would restore Idaho's corporate income tax rate to 8%, its level from 1987 through 2000, add an additional tax for individual income taxpayers who earn more than $250,000 a year, or $500,000 for a married couple. Now, again, that sounds like an awful lot of money, but if you've been paying attention to what's been happening with inflation and the cost of living, a lot of people are actually making pretty decent money, and that's not quite the astronomical, jet set number that it once was. Those taxpayers would pay a new rate of 10.925%, but only on that portion they earn over those amounts. No one earning less than those amounts would see any increase. That's not exactly true. Because the people whose taxes are being raised, whether it's through expenditures that they have to make in terms of their property taxes, their income, their businesses, and so forth, those taxes do get passed along, albeit indirectly. This year, the legislature lowered the top individual income tax rate from 6.5% to 6%, and also lowered the corporate tax rate from 6.5% to 6%. So the plan is going to raise an estimated $323 million a year for K through 12 public education in Idaho. And again, it's wonderful from the standpoint of, they probably could use that money. But how much of that money is going to actually go to the students as opposed to simply maintaining the system itself? That's where it gets a little murkier. That's where we're not quite so sure that this is going to pan out as advertised. I would say approach it. Look, you can be supportive of government education. You can be supportive of the idea that, yes, every Idaho student deserves a quality education. But the question that you should be asking yourself is, why is it being portrayed as something other than what it is, which is a tax hike? Come on. I'm sure you feel it when you gas up your car, when you go grocery shopping, when you look at the fact that every dollar you have in the bank is worth less thanks to inflation than it was last month. It seems to me that government at some point is going to have to learn to make do with less and work smarter instead of harder to take that tax money from us. Maybe this is one of those times we need to apply that kind of thinking, or at the very least question what actually is being intended and why Can't we get some serious questions asked by the media? Why is it so warm and fluffy? Why does it have to be portrayed as, well, this is the answer to all of our prayers, as if the state can never be wrong? And more money? Well, it should be considered a privilege to find yourself paying more in taxes. I don't want to sound unpatriotic, but I don't find that a real privilege at all, especially if it's not giving us the greatest bang for the buck. And again, I come back to the idea, our Idaho students, they may be 50th out of 50 states in terms of per pupil spending, but how are they performing? And if their performance is not in last place, then maybe we should take a closer look, because somebody's clearly doing something right. All right, let's move on to the story for which I have to give you a little bit of a trigger warning. This is going to revisit an event that came up last month. Long before Patriot Front came, Idaho political figures targeted Pride event. Now, of course, you remember last month there were a number of Patriot Front members, I think 31 in all, that were arrested at a Coeur d'Alene Pride event that was taking place as part of Pride Month in June. Now, that was a big deal, and it got a lot of national attention. But I wanted you to pay close attention to the guilt by association game that's being played here by Boise State Public Radio in this story. And I'm going to point out some of the very key, heavily laden words that are giving judgment, as opposed to just simply giving you facts and encouraging you to make up your own mind. The arrest of 31 members of a white supremacist group, allegedly on their way to riot at a North Idaho gay pride celebration, shocked people across the country. But it didn't come out of nowhere. Ooh, they're going to make some connections for us. Political figures in Idaho and Washington had been demonizing, not disagreeing, demonizing the event for months. And that vitriol, not disagreement, vitriol had gone viral, gaining the attention of far-right politicians and prominent bigots across the country. I mean, we mention them in the same breath as if it's a distinction without a difference. I mean, as far as the article's concerned. It's a prime example of how wild conspiracy theories are rocketing from the fringes to the mainstream and potentially upping the chances for violent reactions. Oh my goodness, I feel like I need to put a cool towel on my head and relax for a minute. Maybe take a Xanax to get over the alarm that this story is generating. Demonizing, vitriol, far-right, prominent bigots, wild conspiracy theories rocketing from the fringes and upping the chances for violent reactions. There's a lot to unpack there, but that's quite a story. So let's take aim at their preferred target here. Long before the white supremacist group Patriot Front showed up in Coeur d'Alene, State Representative Heather Scott helped spread vitriol against a planned gay pride event. Scott did not respond to interview requests. Probably a good move on her part, because I don't think whoever wrote this article was necessarily going to give her a fair shake. Back in April, Scott organized an event during which she called the leaders of a far-right motorcycle group, Panhandle Patriots Riding Club, to the stage. It's worth noting that anybody who isn't in lockstep with whatever degree of leftist ideology the writer of this story or the media outlet is marching to is considered to be far right. So when you hear that label, maybe consider how it is relative to where the person making those accusations is actually standing. In a video posted to YouTube, Jeff White, the so-called sergeant-at-arms of the Panhandle Patriots. By the way, most motorcycle clubs do have a sergeant-at-arms. You know who else does? Various civic groups. So don't take it too personally when they say so-called. Took the mic and mentioned a family day in a Coeur d'Alene park in June before pivoting abruptly to Pride in the park. Jeff White said they are having Gay Pride Day in the very same park the very next day, where they will be allowed to parade through all of Coeur d'Alene, drag queen dancers, education hour, making all this material available for all the kids in the park that is designed for kids, he said. And then listen to this ominous slant. Then his language took a turn toward the violent. Good people need to stand up, White said. We say, damn the repercussions, stand up, take it to the head, go to the fight if you can, possibly. Now, it's interesting that this is received, or at least is perceived and translated by the filter of this particular writer, that's a call toward violence. I mean, I've seen the YouTube clip and I've seen Mr. White's speech, and he's definitely saying we need to stand up. We need to fight for what is right. He's not talking about a physical knockdown altercation. He's not talking about rioting and burning down neighborhoods because a Supreme Court decision didn't go the way that we wanted it to. He's talking about standing up against something that very reasonable people can agree is not fitting for children. But of course, with accusations of, bigotry on the rise here, who wants to be the one to stand up and say, hey, this isn't right? So I applaud him for at least standing up and being willing to be counted. But the idea that, it's immediately a call for violence, I think that might be more projection on the part of those who are trying to claim that he took a turn toward the violent. Back to Heather Scott, the article goes. The Idaho state representative who introduced the bikers. She's represented a corner of North Idaho for 3 terms and is running unopposed for a 4th. Scott continued to attack Pride in the Park after posting her event video in April. Now, she says churches, Satanists, libraries, Idaho State Police, anti-gun groups, the museum, Tomlinson Sotheby's International Realty, U.S. Bank, a clown, and I'm sure a lot of sex offenders and pedophiles join in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho this weekend to meet your children at the Pride in the Park event. She wrote on her Facebook page June 7th. Now, I'll grant you, that's pretty direct talk. But I want you to note, too, if she was really picking on this poor, pitiful, marginalized group that nobody supports and is out there just, fighting for their very existence, would churches, would libraries, would institutions and agencies like the Idaho State Police and the museum and this Tomlinson Sotheby's International Realty, U.S. Bank, and others, would corporate America have been waving that rainbow flag so furiously? No. I mean, look, I don't mean to burst anybody's bubble, but if you are part of the LGBTQ plus community, you are no longer part of a marginalized minority. You're very clearly running with the in crowd. You're running with the centers of power. And frankly, there's a good number of them that are acting like that. It's not a matter of, hey, we just want to be left alone. It's you will pay attention to us or else. But as far as the idea of sex offenders and pedophiles, hey, can you think of a Pride event that isn't somehow steeped in sexualization of the various, deviancy that is on display? I mean, that's the whole idea is, look, we're out here, we're proud, we're flaunting this. You can't disagree with this. But it all comes down to these are very sexual kinds of events. People dress in very sexually suggestive clothing. There's plenty of sex toys being waved around and whatnot. And again, if this is what consenting adults want to do, on their own time, or at least, in a place that's not set up for kids, knock yourself out. If that's what floats your boat, that's fine. But when you're targeting it to kids, gee, I mean, why wouldn't pedophiles think, all right, man, finally, somebody who sees, the potential to broach sexual topics with children? It may not be a kind way to say it, but it's not an entirely untrue statement, although you're going to see that this article very clearly says, oh, no, it's nothing more than a conspiracy theory. Former Washington State Rep Matt Shea, who until 2021 represented a district on the Idaho border, also, here it is, attacked the event. A member of his church was among the Patriot Front members arrested. So are we drawing an association there too? I guess, it's a person from church. Therefore, religion probably is suspect in some regard, as according to the Spokesman Review. I don't know how you can look at this and say it's just a conspiracy. Now, they say there is, of course, no evidence of any sex offenders or pedophiles at the event. Did you look? Because, if you haven't looked at the Twitter group Libs of TikTok, you'll find that there are some pretty dedicated people out there who are very much into pedophilia and grooming children. And I don't necessarily mean grooming them for sexual activities, but actually grooming them to be dutiful little leftists. So to say there's no evidence, that doesn't speak to me of somebody who actually has done their homework to prove and can show you conclusively, here's how we know that there was none of this going on. But instead, they say this is a reference to grooming, a wild conspiracy theory, born of another wild conspiracy theory, QAnon. So, QAnon, Trump is going to be taking office again any day. Yeah, if we're going to push people to the fringes, let's push them as hard as we can. Adherents of QAnon believe there's a satanic cabal of powerful people preying on children. And that's morphed into a theory that more and more political figures like Scott are parroting as grooming, a term meaning making children more susceptible to pedophilic advances. Now, this term is almost always leveled at members of the LGBTQ plus community and especially transgender Americans. Well, let's look at this. It's grooming. And it is predatory, but it's not purely about pedophilia. I mean, in some cases it could be, but the more prominent objective here is ideological grooming. And if you want to ask yourself, well, why would they resort to ideological grooming? Well, I think the goal here is to disrupt the normal development of kids, to lure them into the leftist fold by showing, hey, there are easy rewards, easy acceptance through conformity to whatever trends are currently fashionable among leftists. It could be critical race theory, could be transsexualism, could be anything else. But the point is they're trying to disconnect these kids from reality, making them believe that fantasy and perception are the same thing as objective facts. And a man dressed as a woman, I'm sorry, that's a form of fantasy. It's not reality. Now, again, for adults who want to do this, look, if that's your thing, knock yourself out. But to bring kids into the mix, this is taking us someplace that someone should rightly be looking at it and saying, maybe we should stand up. Now, take a look at this poster. Tell me that this doesn't have some connotation of trying to bring children into this kind of mindset. You asked, so we're planning our first real youth drag show. If you have an interest in dressing up in drag and performing, now is your chance. All performers have to sign up. We'll have some special guests with us for the evening, so get ready to strut your stuff. A youth drag show. Seriously. But we're supposed to believe that, again, this is just some wild conspiracy theory. Only some kook would believe this. Back to the article. There's no evidence that Scott or the biker group is connected to Patriot Front. This was buried pretty deep in the article, but hey, look, maybe they really aren't part of this white supremacist group that we've asserted, but there's a spokesman here for an extremist watchdog group. I think sometimes these are better described as professional alarmists, who said mainstreaming these conspiracy theories can embolden more extreme groups and could lead to violence. And again, I hear a lot of concerns about violence, but I don't see it happening outside of the political left, at least not at this time. I do see a lot of concerned faces on the political right, but nothing going out there burning down cities and otherwise accosting and assaulting people, blocking traffic and the like because they have a point to make. Now, Donald Williamson, executive director for the Boise Pride Festival, which will take place in September, said the promotion of these ideas by political figures is infuriating and potentially dangerous. It's definitely playing with fire, he said. Hateful rhetoric can be loud and it can be hurtful, and we just have to band together as a community to stand up and say that that's not right and be louder. As for Boise's Pride Festival, Williamson said, they'll be taking the normal security precautions they always do. He said, sadly, these threats are nothing new for the LGBTQ plus community. The community has always been for decades a target, so they'll always have to be mindful of their surroundings, especially if they're living in a conservative area. Isn't that something? Because if you are conservative in your thinking, you probably are just waiting to do violence to people. I want to come back to the idea here, though, that maybe there is a time where it's appropriate to stand up and put your foot down and draw a line and establish boundaries, particularly where children are concerned. Because if someone was trying to brainwash kids, what form do you suppose that would take? Would it be violent, or would it be something that was made to seem fun and cool and that makes you earn brownie points? Take a look at this.
Everyone around the world should celebrate Pride. Pride means that you're special.
Yeah.
And loving.
Yeah.
And kindness.
Yeah, Pride does mean all those things. So what is Pride?
About people who are queer, and queer is two people of the same gender who have crushes at each other.
Do you think kids should be at Pride?
Yeah. Usually they mostly experience, in stories, straight stuff. So it's good for kids to also know about queer stuff. I am non-binary.
Yeah?
I have the perfect cape for it.
A flag. Yes.
It is fantabulous. I don't care if anyone says no if this is not fantabulous.
because it is. I mean, look, I'm not saying everybody needs to be, of a puritanical nature, but I think we can rightly agree that the people in thongs twerking in front of children is questionable at best. And maybe in places where logic and truth are still, somewhat rooted in reality, is simply unacceptable. But in order to get there, you've got to have some pretty thick skin, because people will resort to calling you bigots. They'll resort to accusing you of engaging in violence simply by disagreeing. And remember, this is coming from the people who claim the banner of tolerance. I mean, you would think if they were really tolerant, they would have to accept that, sometimes you're going to encounter people whose beliefs do not align with your own. Nobody on the political right is saying, hey, we need to attack these people. They're simply saying, don't be doing this in front of kids. And especially keep your hands off my kids. But of course, we get some mixed messages sometimes. Here's a good example of that. From a pride rally, you can't see very well there. His sign says, "Silence is violence." And yet, if you take a closer look at what he's saying on the front of his shirt, why be racist, sexist, or homophobic, or transphobic when you could just be quiet? And sadly, that is what a lot of people choose to do. They choose to just be quiet because they don't want to be called names, and they don't want to be, singled out as somehow being a vector for hate. You don't have to be hateful in putting your foot down and establishing boundaries of what is appropriate and what isn't. You do have to be courageous, because right now you're bucking pretty much the full weight of the system, including most of the institutions in society that have somehow, glommed on to the LGBTQ plus movement and are pushing it for all they're worth. There was a time when the LGBT community said, leave us alone. And frankly, I believe that most members of that community are private and really, they don't live their lives as a political statement. At least the people that I know personally who are part of that community, that would describe them. They're not about making this everybody's business. But the really militant activists, they demand your attention. And they insist, if you're not paying attention to me, somehow you're denying my ability to exist. And now they're taking that demand for attention and putting it in front of your children. So when leaders speak up, and knowing that you're an elected official, you're already under scrutiny, and people are looking for any reason to disagree. So, for Heather Scott, I say kudos for her, kudos to Matt Shea as well for speaking up and saying this isn't right. Now, could they say it, in a way that's not going to offend anybody? Probably not. This is one of those issues where if you're going to make a stand, you're just going to have to get used to the fact that somebody is going to be offended. And this is particularly true when you have people that are actively looking for reasons to be offended so that they can play the victim, because victims are never responsible for their circumstances. The best thing I can advise is be clear on what the boundaries are. Be clear on your understanding of right and wrong. And when you see people who do have the courage to speak up and draw a line, stand up with them. Don't sit there and cower in the crowd and try to, just blend in so that nobody will criticize you. You'll be surprised how contagious that courage is. And sometimes that hard stand needs to be taken. You can't compromise. Don't worry about accusations of being a bigot. That word has become meaningless in the sense that truth and logic are considered bigoted principles at this time. If you're rooted in reality, you're going to take heat for it. So be one of those people who can stand up and be a source of light in a society that is embracing darkness in some really unusual and very, very public ways. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in